Hello everyone, welcome to my shop. In this video I'm going to be replacing the rear wheel bearing on my Nissan 350Z. Process should be the same for the Infiniti G35 as well. One quick note before we get into this, this rear wheel bearing replacement does require access to a press or a bearing separator setup. If you don't have one, you may be able to work with your local auto shop or with your local parts store to get the parts, to get the tools and things you need. We'll get into it more as we get into the video. So I'm going to move some things around and we'll get started. So before we get started, just real quick, some ways to diagnose bad wheel bearing. Front wheel bearings are a little bit easier to diagnose. You can typically hear a whirring sound or a grinding sound that'll get worse as you get up to speed. You can also typically feel it or hear a major sound change as you saw the wheel back and forth. Rear wheels, it's a little bit harder just because you don't have quite as much motion in the back and you tend to have a little bit more noise coming from the back. In my case, this is real dead. Unfortunately, the 350Z wheel bearings, both front and rear, are a weak point on this car if you are tracking the car and running big sticky tires like I am, especially with extra power and a wing and downforce. So if you are tracking your Z or your G35, make sure you check these on a regular basis. I let this go way too far. I'm lucky I didn't have a major failure. So as I said, if you ever have a question with the vehicle in the air, there should be no play in this. If you're pushing at like 6 o'clock and 12 o'clock, there should be no play like this. So if you're on the front wheel, you don't want to go front to back because your steering linkage, you may see it, but as I said, top to bottom, there should be no play. So as I said, this one's real dead, so we'll get into it. First step after removing the wheel is going to be, there should be a cotter pin that is in your rear CV shaft. You will need to remove this. You will need like a set of pliers, maybe a set of needle nose. You will ultimately need to replace this, so don't worry about damaging it as you do it. Just be careful of the threads. You don't want to go in here with anything too aggressive where you might scratch or bend a thread that may come back to haunt you later. Next up, and this is, various people do this different ways. I'm going to go ahead and take the axle nut off first because this way I've got the vehicle in gear, or if you have an automatic, have it in park, and I've got my parking brake set. So that's going to help keep this from rotating and help keep the axle from rotating as I remove this. This is a 32 millimeter 6-point hex. You will probably need either a pretty good impact or worst case scenario, you could actually put the wheel back on, take the center cap out of the wheel, have the weight of the vehicle on this, and then you can loosen it. So fortunately I've had mine apart a couple of times before, so my nut wasn't too seized on there. This car also doesn't see any salt or anything like that, so there wasn't any rust. It came loose really easy. I'm not actually going to take it all the way off yet, so that as I work there's no risk of the CV shaft getting bumped. But the other thing you can do now, you should have play in the CV shaft. You can see this moving in and out. If for some reason you didn't, that probably means that you've got some corrosion on your CV shaft. Thread this in a little bit so that you don't have the end of the shaft sticking out, and take a soft hammer or a piece of wood and then a metal hammer and hit this until you have some play in here. As I said, that's going to make getting the bearing out easier here in a few minutes. Next step is going to be to remove the caliper. In my case, I have the Brembo set up, but I believe the factory, the single piston calipers are probably the same. You need a 19 millimeter socket. Remove the two mounting bolts on the back side. This will be a little bit of a challenge. You don't have a ton of room to work. You may be able to move your brake line. Obviously watch your paint with any tools as you do this. I'm going to go ahead and get both the bolts broke loose and then we'll come back. I've got the lower bolt and upper bolt basically all the way out at this point. One thing to note, I did end up using a 19 millimeter open-ended wrench on the lower bolt. It's just really hard to get access to because of a rear traction arm. So both fasteners removed. Watch your soft brake line as you do this. Watch your pads. I'm going to move this up and hang it out of the way so that it is out of our working area. Just make sure that you don't kink or do anything to damage your braided line. At this point we need to remove the brake rotor itself. You do need to release your parking brake. Depending on the condition of your parking brake and the shoes and everything in here. You may have to loosen the parking brake shoes for your parking brake. Fortunately, I don't need to, so I'm just going to work my brake rotor out and set it out of the way. At this point, this is all we need to take apart if all you're doing is removing your wheel bearing and not servicing your brakes or anything like that. So I'm going to move the camera around, move the car, get the car up further in the air just so it's easier to film, and we'll go about getting the bolts out for this and remove the wheel bearing. So real quick, what we're trying to do, there are 4 bolts on the back side here. We've got one and then a second one up high. The ones on the other side are a little harder to see and get light on, at least with the camera, but same thing on the other side. There's a lower one and an upper one. These are 17 millimeter hex. They are a challenge to get to with the CV in place, but it can be done. You do need either a wobble socket. You basically need a wobble extension for a 3/8 drive with a couple different lengths, but you can get these out. If you absolutely cannot get to these, you can remove the CV from the vehicle. You would have to remove these 6 nuts and bolts, and then you could actually drop the CV down and pull it out, and then you'd have really easy access. But that you really, at that point, you should be replacing at least the lock nuts on here. So I'm going to avoid doing that. I know I can get it out without having to remove that. Real quick, this is also where loosening that nut on the end helps, because I can compress this a little bit, and that does give me a little bit more room to access with the ratchet. So said one more reason to make sure that you get this nut loose early in the process and make sure that this moves okay. At this point, I have all 4 bolts pretty loose, but not I haven't actually removed any of them yet. What you need to check at this point is you need to be able to push on these bolts and actually have the wheel bearing itself move. If you live in an area that has any corrosion, or these wheel bearings have been on the vehicle for any length of time, you can get some corrosion around the bearing itself into the hub, and it may be very difficult to remove. I'm very fortunate these haven't been in the car that long, so mine have come loose. I can literally push on it and I can see the bearing move itself. If for some reason this is really stuck, you've got a couple of options. You could come in here with the bolts loose but not removed. You could come in here, use an extension or a long punch, and use a hammer and hit on one or more of these bolts to try and drive it out. The other option you've got, since this bearing is already pretty screwed, you could hit on the hub itself, avoid your studs, and try and break this free. Worst case scenario, you could also grab onto this with a slide hammer, and that might also be a good way to pull it loose. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and finish removing the axle nut off the end, because I'm going to be pushing the bearing out. Next, I'm going to finish removing the remainder of the 4 bolts that are holding the wheel bearing on. At this point, I have all 4 bolts loose. I have the nut off the end of the CV shaft. This will work its way out. It just clears the brake shoes, so you may have to kind of wiggle it and move some things around. As I said, if this shaft wasn't loose, you'd have a hard time, but I'm just going to go ahead and I'm pulling it straight out the front. I'm going to set it out of the way. Make sure that your CV is supported and isn't going to go anywhere. So the CV shaft is supported. So now I'm going to take the hub and wheel bearing assembly over to the bench, and we'll talk about trying to get these apart and get this old bearing off and get the new bearing onto this hub. I've got the bearing off the car. The next step is going to be pressing this apart. As I said, this does require some special equipment. You do need a bearing splitter. You may be able to borrow this from your local parts store or something like that. You will need probably a hydraulic press. So when you press this apart, you are going to destroy this bearing. It may actually take a couple of tries to actually get all the parts apart. I've got the bearing and hub set up in the bearing splitter. I'm using a standard 32 millimeter socket. Anything that will slide all the way through the bearing, but it actually presses on the hub itself will work. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and press the hub out. As you're doing this, safety glasses, be very careful. You're going to be exerting a lot of force. You don't want to damage or shoot anything anywhere. Now, I got lucky because my bearing splitter was able to grab the inner race. Sometimes this inner race will be stuck on here, and you will have to reposition your bearing splitter and press it off again to get this inner race. As I said, this inner race can get stuck. This bearing is now completely destroyed, not reusable in any way, shape, or form. Now is a good time to inspect this hub before you press it in. Make sure there are no cracks or anything around here. You do want to clean this hub off and make sure that there's no major marring. There's some scoring and stuff on this one. This is actually from my passenger side, the one that wasn't all torn up. This is actually the driver's side. It's probably hard to see in the video here. As I said, there's some kind of markings on this. There's grooves, and you can actually feel damaged metal here. I've now ordered a new hub. This hub I cannot reuse. The bearing won't press onto this anymore. It's actually changed size because of all the material removal. For the reassembly process, you've got your new bearing, you've got your hub. As I said, make sure this is good and clean. When you press this together, there is a machine side of the bearing and a non-machine side of the bearing. You're going to press from the non-machine side up into the bearing. When you're doing this, you need to make sure that you are supporting the inner race of this bearing. So I happen to have this slug from another press set. I'm going to have that underneath the bearing. That way I'm pressing on the inner race. If you were to press on the outer race or to press out here, you actually risk damaging the bearing. So as I said, you do need to press on this inner race. You will need something to press on here. I'm going to use the same 32mm socket that I used before, making sure that you're not going to damage this face or catch in any of this kind of non-flat surface. As you start to press this, you need to be extremely careful and make sure that this doesn't get crooked. So it's a good idea to press a little bit, release, make sure everything kind of settles. And as I press down on this, you actually saw it start to kind of realign itself. So I'm actually going to relieve pressure, make sure everything's still centered, and continue the press. I've just seated the bearing. So the next step is the factory service manual says that you need to press this to 11,000 pounds. So I'm going to read the gauge up here, press it to 11,000 pounds, and let it hold for a couple of seconds. 11,000 pounds is the factory manual. You do need to be up around that to make sure that you actually get the proper load on the bearings. At this point, I have a hub assembly that's ready to go back on the car. So I'm going to do the other one, and we'll go back to the garage and we'll start reassembling this. I've got a new hub as well as a new bearing pressed together with my studs swapped over. Before we go ahead and install this on the vehicle, we want to clean this area up a little bit. You can use brake cleaner, you can use a bunch of different stuff. I'm going to spray off. I want to clean inside where the bearing sits in here and make sure that that's clean. If you've got a bunch of rust or debris in here, you might take some Scotch-Brite or something like that, some really fine grit sandpaper, and just kind of clean up any rust in here. I don't really have any, so I'm just going to spray this with brake cleaner, clean it up, clean the splines, clean the threads on the CV shaft, and get this ready to accept the bearing. I've gone ahead and cleaned up where the bearing seats and the spline of the CV. I'm going to go ahead and apply some anti-seize to where the bearing pilots on the inside, avoiding the face. You don't want anything to reduce friction where the bearing actually seats. And I'm also going to apply grease to the spline, avoiding the threads. Once again, you don't want anything to change the friction properties of the threads. So inside the bore and on the splines, and then we'll go ahead and start assembling this. Now that I have anti-seize on everything, which is purely just to help make sure that you can take all this stuff apart later, I'm going to go ahead and start reassembling the bearing onto the spindle and getting the spline engaged in the new hub. There is a pattern. This is not universal. The upper two bolt holes are a little closer together. You need to match it up with the upper two holes on here. Worst case scenario, you put it on, you have to take it off, flip it over. So to start working it in, the CV will fight you a little bit. You may have to rotate the spindle a little bit. So I've got gone ahead. So I've got my spindle in. I'm going to go ahead and just start the nut on here, just to make sure that everything kind of stays in place and doesn't move around too much on me. Next step, I'm going to move around to the back side. We're going to repeat the process for removing them. You don't want to tighten this nut too much because you are going to need to be able to push the CV back to be able to access the nuts or the bolts on the back side. So move around and we'll get everything tightened up. I've gone ahead and hand started all 4 fasteners just to make sure that I had them lined up. Same 4 fasteners we removed before. Torque spec on these is 62 foot-pounds or 85 newton meters. There's actually a pretty big range, about plus or minus 5 foot-pounds or plus or minus 10 newton meters, but the middle is, as I said, 62 foot-pounds or 85 newton meters. I'm going to go ahead, tighten all these up, go ahead and torque them all, and then we'll work on getting the axle nut and everything else tightened up. Now that I have the bearing tightened up, the next step I'm going to do, I'm just going to go ahead and snug up this axle nut. That's just going to pull the CV in and just make sure that it kind of takes some of the slop out. Next step is going to be to reinstall your brake rotor. Next step is going to be to reinstall the brake rotor or brake caliper. In the case of the Brembo, the torque for the caliper to the bracket is 62 foot-pounds or about 85 newton meters. Once again, there's a range, but that's kind of the target range there. As you're torquing this, be very careful of your paint. Once again, you don't have a ton of room to work in here. For the lower bolt, it may be easier to access with a wobble extension. That way you can at least use a torque wrench. One of the last steps, now that I've got the caliper on, wheel bearings on, is to final tighten the axle nut here. The torque spec on this is 176 foot-pounds or 238 newton meters or so. I said there's once again a range. This can be a bit of a challenge depending on the differential that you've got and whether the car's in gear or whatnot. Best thing to do is vehicle in gear. If you can set your parking brake, set your parking brake. The other option you've got is you can shove a screwdriver into your brake rotor and that will keep it from rotating. If you do that, get a piece of wood, thin piece of metal, something to put between the screwdriver and your brake rotor or your caliper, especially if you care about the paint on your caliper. So I'm going to go ahead, torque this. As I said, it is 176 foot-pounds or 238 newton meters. Once you've torqued the nut, the last step is to replace the cotter pin. A 5/32 1.5 inch long cotter pin is what I found. To pick this up at like Tractor Supply or a parts store or Home Depot or something like that. Put it in, bend the tabs in each direction, being careful to make sure that they clear everything. Watch your threads as you do this. Once the cotter pin's on, next step is to reinstall the wheel. And that's it. Wheel lugs are torqued back on. Factory specs 80 foot-pounds. I go a little bit higher because my aftermarket studs, but said not the easiest task. Does require some special tooling. As I said, you've got to have access to a press, but something very super critical to kind of pay attention to, especially if you're tracking your Z or your G. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Otherwise, please like and subscribe. Tune back in. I'll be doing some more videos on this as well as some of my other cars and as I get ready for next season. Once again, thanks for watching.